The woman's fingers closed around my wrist so suddenly that I nearly dropped the coffee in my hand. Her face was pale, her breath unsteady, and behind her, a broad-shouldered man in a gray coat was forcing his way through the crowded station with his eyes fixed directly on us. She leaned close enough that I could feel her trembling and whispered, "Pretend you know me." I had never seen her before in my life, but the terror in her eyes made the decision for me. I smiled, pulled her into a careful embrace, and said loudly that I had been waiting for her. What happened in the next few minutes would uncover a secret, reopen a wound I had spent years trying to bury, and change the direction of my life forever. Before we continue, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances. Your support helps our family keep sharing stories that remind us one compassionate choice can change everything. My name is Everett Hale, and on that bright Tuesday morning, I was standing inside Union Station with nowhere I truly wanted to go. Sunlight poured through the high glass windows, warming the marble floor and catching in the steam rising from paper cups. Travelers moved around me with rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and important destinations. I had a destination too, technically. A train was supposed to take me to my hometown for the sale of my late father's house, but I had delayed buying the ticket until the last possible moment. I had not returned to Bellwether in almost 9 years. I told myself it was because of work, distance, and timing, but the truth was much simpler. I was afraid of the memories waiting there. Then the stranger grabbed me, and suddenly my own fears became smaller than the danger closing in behind her. She was perhaps 30, with auburn hair pinned loosely at the back of her head and a cream-colored coat that looked too thin for the cold. A bruise darkened one side of her wrist, visible where her sleeve had pulled back. The man approaching us slowed when I wrapped an arm around her shoulders. His expression changed from anger to calculation. I did not know what role I was supposed to play, so I acted like someone who belonged in her life. I touched her shoulder gently, asked whether she had found the bakery she was looking for, and told her my sister was waiting near the ticket booths. The details came from nowhere, but the woman understood immediately. She nodded, forced a smile, and held tightly to the front of my jacket. The man stopped several yards away. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then he raised one hand as if greeting an old acquaintance and called her by the name Clara. Her body stiffened against mine that I guided her toward the busiest part of the station without looking back. We passed a group of tourists, a uniformed security officer, and a family gathered around a stroller. Only when we reached the information desk did she release my jacket. Her name was not Clara. It was Rosamund Pierce, though most people called her Rosie. The man was her former fiancé, Grant Mercer, and he had been following her since she left a courthouse 2 blocks away. She had gone there to file for a protective order after months of intimidation, threats, and apologies that always became threats again. Grant had discovered where she was going. He had been waiting outside when she emerged. She had entered the station because it was crowded, hoping he would lose sight of her, but he followed. Rosie spoke quickly, then stopped as though ashamed of how much she had revealed to a stranger. She kept saying she was sorry for involving me. I told her she had nothing to apologize for, though my hands had begun to shake now that I understood the seriousness of what had happened. The security officer escorted us into a small office while another officer searched the station. Rosie sat beneath fluorescent lights with both hands wrapped around a cup of water. She looked exhausted rather than relieved. That unsettled me. Relief should have arrived when help did, but she seemed like someone who had stopped believing help could last. While we waited, she explained that Grant had never struck her in the way people imagined abuse looked. He controlled her bank account, read her messages, decided which friends were trustworthy, and convinced her that every disagreement proved she was unstable. When she tried to leave, he threatened to destroy her career. Rosie worked as a speech therapist at a children's rehabilitation center, and Grant had begun sending anonymous complaints to her employer. He wanted her frightened, isolated, and dependent. The bruise on her wrist came from that morning, when he grabbed her outside the courthouse and told her she was humiliating him, her story pulled me into a memory I had avoided for years. My younger sister, Maribel, had once tried to tell me something similar about the man she married. I had been 28 then, ambitious, impatient, and proud of being the sensible one in our family. Maribel said her husband monitored her spending and became frightening when she mentioned leaving. I told her marriage was difficult. I told her people said things during arguments that they did not mean. Worst of all, I told her not to make a decision she might regret. 3 weeks later, she packed a suitcase and drove away alone. Her car left the road during a rainstorm after several unanswered calls from her husband. The police ruled it an accident, but I always wondered whether she had been crying, frightened, or looking over her shoulder. My father blamed me without ever saying the words. I blamed myself enough for both of us. Rosie noticed the change in my face and asked whether I was all right. I almost gave her the usual answer, but something about the room, the daylight through the narrow window, and the cup trembling in her hands made lying feel cruel. I told her about Maribel. I admitted that I had failed to listen because listening would have required me to accept that something terrible was happening, and I had preferred an easier explanation. Rosie did not comfort me immediately. She simply said that people often missed the truth because the truth demanded action. Her words hurt, but they were not unkind. They were honest in the way Maribel had needed me to be honest years ago. I realized that helping Rosie could not erase what I had done, but walking away now would repeat it. The station officers found Grant near a side exit and detained him until the police arrived. Rosie was asked to give another statement. She had no family nearby, and the friend who had promised to meet her at the courthouse was not answering. Her phone battery was nearly dead. The officer suggested she wait until arrangements could be made for someone to escort her home. Without fully considering what it meant for my trip, I offered to stay. Rosie protested that I had already done enough, but I knew I could not board a train while she sat alone watching every door. I exchanged my ticket for a later departure and spent the next 2 hours beside her in the station cafe. Outside, the morning brightened into a clear, cold afternoon. Inside, we spoke about ordinary things because ordinary conversation seemed to remind her that she was still a person, not merely a witness in a police report. Rosie told me she had grown up near the coast in a household filled with music. Her mother taught piano, and her father repaired fishing boats. She had chosen speech therapy after helping a childhood friend regain language following a brain injury. She loved seeing children discover that frustration did not mean failure. Grant had once admired that dedication. Later, he resented every hour she spent helping anyone but him. He began appearing at her workplace unexpectedly, bringing flowers after arguments so everyone would think he was devoted. He knew how to make cruelty look like concern. Rosie confessed that part of her still felt guilty for reporting him because he had apologized that morning. Then he had seized her wrist. She knew guilt was one of the chains he had left behind. By early afternoon, her friend finally called. She had been in a minor car accident while driving to the courthouse and was receiving treatment for a fractured arm. Rosie's face collapsed when she heard. The friend was safe, but she could not come. A police officer offered to drive Rosie to a temporary shelter, yet Rosie hesitated. Grant knew her apartment, workplace, routines, and friends. She feared that entering a shelter meant admitting her life had disappeared. I understood that fear better than I wanted to. After Maribel's death, I had moved away, changed jobs, and avoided my father's calls. I told everyone I was rebuilding, but really I had erased every place where guilt could find me. Avoidance had not healed me. It had only made my world smaller. I asked Rosie whether she would allow me to call someone from the rehabilitation center she trusted. She gave me the name of her supervisor, Lenora Whitcomb. Lenora answered immediately. Within 20 minutes, she had arranged a secure guest apartment owned by the center, contacted an attorney who assisted employees facing domestic abuse, and reassured Rosie that the anonymous complaints against her had already been traced to Grant's email activity. Rosie stared at the phone after the call ended, stunned by the discovery that people had noticed, believed her, and were ready to help. Grant had convinced her she was one mistake away from losing everything. In reality, the community around her had simply been waiting for permission to stand beside her. The police escorted us from the station after Grant was formally taken into custody for violating an existing no-contact warning related to an earlier incident. Rosie asked whether I would ride with her to the guest apartment. I agreed. The drive took place under a wide blue sky, past office buildings reflecting sunlight and bare trees casting delicate shadows across the road. Rosie sat in the back seat, silent for most of the journey. As we approached the center, she said she could not understand why a stranger had stayed. I told her the truth. Years earlier, someone I loved had asked me to see her fear, and I had looked away. Rosie had given me another chance to become the person Maribel had needed. The guest apartment was on the second floor of a brick building beside the rehabilitation center. Lenora met us outside with a ring of keys, a bag of groceries, and a kind expression that did not contain pity. Several co-workers had already brought clean clothes, toiletries, and a small vase of yellow tulips. Rosie began crying when she saw them. Not loud, broken sobs, but quiet tears that seemed to come from exhaustion deeper than sleep could fix. Lenora embraced her and said the apartment was hers for as long as necessary. There would be no pressure to return to work, no judgment, and no explaining required. Watching them, I understood how different Maribel's life might have been if the people around her had responded that way. Before I left, Rosie handed me a folded piece of paper. On it, she had written her phone number and a sentence beneath it: "You believed me before you knew anything about me." I carried those words onto the late afternoon train. The countryside moved beyond the windows in golden sunlight, fields and houses sliding past like scenes from a life I had abandoned. By the time I reached Bellwether, I knew I could not simply sign the sale documents and leave. My father was waiting at the old house, older and thinner than I remembered, sitting on the front porch beneath the maple tree Maribel and I had climbed as children. For several minutes, we looked at each other without speaking. Inside the house, every room held evidence of the years I had missed. My father had kept Maribel's photographs on the mantel and her blue scarf hanging near the door. I expected anger from him, but what I found was something worse: grief softened by time and loneliness. He admitted that he had blamed me after the accident because blaming me was easier than admitting he had also dismissed Maribel's fears. She had spoken to him before she came to me. He had told her Grant, her husband, not Rosie's former fiancé, was under pressure and deserved patience. We had both failed her, then spent 9 years punishing each other because neither of us knew how to forgive ourselves. We sat in the sunlit kitchen until evening shadows began stretching across the yard, though the day remained bright. I told my father about Rosie and the station. He listened without interrupting. When I described how she had whispered for me to pretend I knew her, he covered his face with both hands. He said perhaps Maribel had placed me there, not as punishment, but as an opportunity. I did not know whether I believed that, yet the thought loosened something inside me. We decided not to sell the house. Instead, we would donate part of its value and transform the unused carriage building into a small daytime resource center for people escaping controlling relationships. It would offer legal referrals, temporary office space, counseling connections, and transportation assistance. We named it Maribel's Door. Rosie and I remained in contact. Her recovery was not simple or quick. Grant's case moved slowly. Some mornings she felt powerful, and other mornings she questioned every choice. She changed her phone number, transferred apartments, and attended counseling. Her co-workers accompanied her to hearings. Lenora helped document the damage Grant had tried to cause professionally. Months later, Rosie returned to the rehabilitation center and began leading communication workshops for women rebuilding confidence after abuse. She said helping others recover their voices helped her trust her own. I traveled between Bellwether and the city while working with my father to establish Maribel's Door. The process forced us to speak about memories we had buried. We argued, apologized, and learned that forgiveness was not a single emotional moment. It was a repeated decision to stop using the past as a weapon. Rosie visited the center before it opened. She stood inside the renovated carriage building on a bright spring morning, surrounded by fresh paint, donated furniture, and windows facing the garden. Above the entrance hung a simple sign shaped like an open doorway. Rosie placed the first vase of yellow tulips on the reception desk. A year after the morning at the station, Maribel's door officially opened. The first person who arrived was a young mother carrying a toddler and a grocery bag filled with documents. She apologized repeatedly for taking up our time. Rosie, who had volunteered to help that day, knelt beside the child and offered him a box of crayons. Then she looked at the mother and said the words she herself had once needed to hear: "You do not have to prove your fear before you deserve help." I watched the mother's shoulders fall as if she had finally put down something impossibly heavy. Later that afternoon, Rosie and I stood outside beneath the maple tree. Sunlight moved through the leaves and scattered across the path. She reminded me that when she first grabbed my wrist, she believed she was asking for 30 seconds of protection. Neither of us could have known she was also pulling me back toward my father, my sister's memory, and a purpose I had spent years avoiding. She had asked me to pretend I knew her, but in helping her, I had finally come to know myself. I was not only the brother who failed Maribel. I was also the man who could learn from that failure, accept responsibility, and choose differently when another frightened person reached out. Rosie eventually testified against Grant, and the court granted a long-term protective order. She did not celebrate the ruling as a victory over him. She described it as the first official document confirming that her life belonged to her. My father attended the hearing with me, carrying a yellow tulip wrapped in paper. Afterward, we all returned to Maribel's door, where sunlight filled the reception room and the voices of volunteers drifted through the building. For the first time in years, remembering my sister did not feel like standing before a locked room. It felt like opening a door. Just before you reach the end of this story, please leave a meaningful comment about a time when someone believed you, helped you, or gave you the courage to begin again. Your words may be exactly what another person in our community needs to read today. Sometimes the greatest lesson is that kindness does not require a complete explanation. We do not need to know someone's entire history before choosing compassion. We only need to recognize fear, pain, or loneliness and decide not to look away. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Everett could not change the moment when he failed his sister, and Rosie could not recover the years Grant had stolen through fear, but together they proved that the past does not have to be the final author of our lives. Sometimes redemption begins in a crowded station, beneath the brightness of an ordinary morning, when a trembling stranger reaches for your hand and asks you to pretend. And sometimes, by choosing to stand beside that stranger, you stop pretending to be brave and finally become brave for real.